Chapter 6. Everything was perfect. The cameras were set so that he could watch from 4 different angles, all in full color. The battle arena well lit, his chair comfortable. He only regretted that he hadn't had time to return to their private residence to watch the entertainment with Alexia by his side, although that had turned out to be advantageous, as well, a silver lining. The training facility's control room had cameras that could be re-angled with the touch of a button, ensuring the clearest possible view. Alfred smiled, watching as Claire hesitated at the door, quite pleased with how his plan had come to fruition. She'd chased him as he'd hoped, stepped into his trap with hardly a struggle. He hadn't expected her to actually fire at him, but that was easily overlooked in retrospect. And truly, it had made the anticipation for her upcoming death all the sweeter, the addition of a personal revenge aspect into the mix. The OR-1, a highly developed BOW specifically created for field combat, was one of Alfred's all-time favorites. The AN-3 Sandworm was impressive, to be sure. The standard Hunter 121's lethal and fast. But the OR-1s were special. The human skeletal structure showed through, particularly in the face and torso, giving them the look of classic death. Their skull faces leered out beneath corded ropes of real and synthetic tendon, like a Neo-Grim Reaper. They weren't just dangerous. The way they looked was terror-inspiring at the most basic level of instinct. The island employees called them Bandersnatches, a nonsense word from some poem that was strangely fitting considering their unique design and function. There were 30 of them at Rockford, half of those in stasis, though Alfred had only been able to account for 8 of them since the attack.
"Oh!"
Claire was opening the door. Elated, Alfred focused his full attention on the girl, his left hand on the camera controls, his right hovering over the lock functions for the storage areas. Claire stepped onto the balcony of the large, open 2-story bay with gun in hand, trying to look everywhere at once. Alfred zoomed in on her face, wanting to fully appreciate her fear, but was disappointed by her lack of expression. After surmising that she was in no immediate danger, she seemed watchful no more.
"But when I push this button..."
Alfred snickered, unable to contain his excitement, lightly stroking his right forefinger across the switches for the bay 2 shuttered storage closets, one on the balcony, one bordering the freight elevator on the lower floor. At his whim, Claire Redfield would die. True, she wasn't important, her death as meaningless as her life surely had been, but it was the control that mattered. His control.
And the pain, the exquisite torture, the look in her eyes when she realizes that her existence is at its end.
Alfred controlled his body as tightly as he controlled his life, and prided himself on his ability to dominate his sexual desires, to feel nothing unless he chose to. But just thinking of Claire's death inspired him in a passion that was beyond physical lust, beyond words, even beyond the simple scope of man's awareness.
"Alexia knows,"
Alfred thought, certain that his beautiful sister was watching too, that she understood what could not be explained. In Claire's death, they would be as close as 2 people ever could be. It was the wonder of their relationship, the culmination of the Ashford legacy. He couldn't contain himself another moment. As Claire took another cautious step into the center of the room, he first locked the door she'd come through, sealing off her escape, and then pressed a button for the 2nd-story shutter release. Instantly, the narrow metal shutter not 10 feet from where she stood slid open, and as Claire stumbled backward, trying to distance herself from the unknown threat, a fully matured Bandersnatch stepped out, ready to engage. It was beautiful, the creature. Between 7 and 8 feet tall, its face was that of a grinning skeleton, its head set low and menacing. The disproportionately huge upper body supported its primary weapon, the right arm, as thick as one of its tree trunk legs, longer than half its full body length at rest, the hand span big enough to cover an ordinary man's entire chest. Its left arm was withered, tiny and misshapen, but a Bandersnatch only needed the one. Alfred had hoped for some exclamation from her, a curse or a scream, but she was silent as she retreated to what she believed to be a safe distance. She opened fire almost immediately. The Bandersnatch roared, a rough, guttural scream, then performed its trick. Alfred had seen it a dozen times, but never tired of watching. The massive right arm snapped toward Claire, probably 15 feet away, the engineered muscles hyperextending, the elastic tendons and legitimate stretching. And it slapped Claire to the ground with scarcely any effort, the girl knocked sprawling before the Bandersnatch's arm snapped back into place.
Yes! Oh, yes!
Claire crabbed backward as fast as she could, stopping only when her back hit the wall. Alfred zoomed in to see that a fine sheen of sweat had broken out across her face, but she still wore no expression beyond a kind of intense watchfulness. She pulled herself to her feet and sidestepped along the wall, moving fast, obviously not wanting to be knocked off the balcony by the creature's next blow. Alfred grinned, ignoring the disappointment that her apparent lack of terror had brought about. She'd be out of wall in another few seconds, backed into a corner.
And then a series of blows, beating her to death against the wall, or a simple neck snap, a grasp of her head and a simple, solid shake. Or will it toy with her, tossing her around like one of Alexia's rag dolls?
Alfred leaned in eagerly, changing the angle for one of the cameras, watching as the doomed girl raised her weapon, taking careful aim in spite of her hopeless position. The Bandersnatch shrieked even louder than the gunshot, shaking its head wildly, dark fluids rushing from its moving face. It sprayed the balcony walls with ichorish liquid, blood, and other things, trying desperately to bring its arm up, to protect or comfort its wound. It all happened so fast, so violently. It was like watching a fountain geyser suddenly explode from a still lake.
The eyes. She went for its eyes.
Claire shot again, and then again, and the Bandersnatch cried out in fury and new pain, still trying to grasp its own injured head as it stumbled around in a weaving circle. And then, to Alfred's shock, it collapsed to the floor, its writhings becoming less and less urgent, its screams becoming a hoarse, dying protest. Stunned with disbelief, Alfred could finally see an emotion on Claire's face. Pity. She moved to stand over the creature and shot once more, stealing it completely. Then she turned and walked toward the stairs as casually as if she was walking away from a lady's luncheon.
No, 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 no!
This was wrong, all wrong. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Furious, he stabbed at the other switch, releasing the second creature from its enclosure, the shutter sliding open behind a stack of storage containers on the elevator level.
You won't be so fortunate this time,
he thought desperately, still barely able to credit what he'd just seen. Claire had heard the second door open, but the sack of containers obscured her point of view, hiding the new menace. She was stopped at the foot of the stairs, holding herself very still, scanning for the exact source of the noise. The second Bandersnatch stepped out of its closet and casually reached up, grasping a large metal crate at the top of a 10-foot stack of them. It pulled itself up, seemingly without effort, and without Claire noticing, her attention too intently fixed on the shadowy corner opposite the stairs. The Bandersnatch reached down for her. Claire saw it coming at the last instant, too late to get out of its way. The creature wrapped its muscular fingers around her head and lifted her up, studying her as a cat studied a mouse.
Or a rat,
Alfred thought, some of his previous joy returning at the sight of the girl dropping her weapon and struggling to free herself, grasping at the OR-1 steel grip with panicked hands. and Alfred's focus was broken at the sound of shattering glass somewhere off-screen, and someone was shooting, the sudden flurry of noise and activity making the Bandersnatch shriek, making it drop Claire.
"What's the window?"
Alfred answered himself, watching in horror as the young prisoner, Burnside, threw himself into the camera shot, firing 2 handguns at once, blasting at the startled creature. Startled, then screaming in agony as Claire scooped up her weapon and joined the fray. The Bandersnatch tried to attack, its arm whipping out toward the new assailant, but it was driven back by the sheer number of rounds being pumped into its body, finally slumping against the storage container. Dead. Without consciously deciding to do it, Alfred reached for the freight elevator controls, a part of him remembering that there was at least one more OR-1 below, as well as a number of virus carriers. The 2 youths stumbled as the floor beneath their feet began to go down, taking them to the basement of the training facility. There were no working cameras there, but enjoying their deaths was no longer Alfred's primary concern. Not so long as they died.
"Can't be! This can't be happening!"
The OR-1 should have dispatched Claire and her meddlesome friend effortlessly, but they were alive and his pets had suffered and died. He tried to convince himself that the 2 would soon perish in the basement, which had been locked down and isolated since the first viral leak. Suddenly, nothing seemed certain anymore.
"Alexia,"
Alfred whispered, feeling the blood drain from his face, feeling his very being flushed with shame. He had to make her see that it wasn't his fault, that his trap had worked perfectly, that the impossible had occurred. And he'd had to accept the subsequent coolness in her gaze, the undertone of disappointment in her sweet voice as she reassured him that she understood. The only thing that surpassed his shame was a newfound hatred for Claire Redfield, burning brighter than 1,000 burning stars. No sacrifice was too great to secure her torment, hers and that of her shining knight. Until both had offered penitence in flesh and blood, Alfred would not rest. He swore it.
"Steve, other side,"
Claire said the instant the freight elevator began to move. Steve nodded. Claire reloaded, and Steve clambered over 2 of the heavy crates, both Lugers raised. As if by silent agreement, neither of them spoke as the lift descended, both watching intently for what came next.
"He saved my life,"
Claire thought wonderingly, watching grease-smeared wall tracks slide past, blood still screaming through her veins from when she'd realized she would die. And Steve Burnside, who she'd written off as a well-intentioned but troubled, barely competent blowhard, had kept that from happening.
"Though he may have only delayed the inevitable."
She didn't know what Alfred had in mind now, but she wasn't looking forward to meeting any more of his friends. 2 skull-faced, rubber-band-armed freaks had been more than enough. She'd been incredibly lucky to get off with a couple of bruises and a sore neck. Claire had expected the elevator to drop them into some sort of BOW holding area, but she was pleasantly disappointed. The massive lift simply came to a stop. There was only one exit that she could see, and although she harbored no illusions about how safe things would be on the other side of that door, it seemed they were out of danger for the moment.
"Hey, Claire, check it out!"
Steve climbed back over the boxes, holding what could only be some kind of submachine gun. Boxy, dark, and deadly-looking with an extended magazine.
"It was behind one of the crates,"
Steve said happily. He'd already stuck the gold Lugers in his belt.
9mm, just like the Lugers in the guard weapons. Oh, by the way, here."
He reached into one of the outside pockets on his camo pants and pulled out 3 clips for the M93R.
"I searched a couple of guards on my way back from the dock. I like the Lugers better now that I've got this."
He held up the new weapon, grinning.
"I don't need the extra hardware. You can have the gun too."
Claire gratefully accepted the clips and the weapon, not sure how to thank him for what he'd done, determined to try anyway.
"Steve, if you hadn't shown up when you did, forget it,"
he said, shrugging.
"We're even now." "Well, thanks all the same,"
Claire said, smiling warmly. He smiled back, and she saw a flicker of real interest in his gaze, a sincerity there that was quite different from his previous posturing. Not sure what to do about it, for him or for herself, she moved the conversation along.
"I thought you were going to wait at the dock," she said.
"It wasn't really a dock," Steve said, and told her what had happened since they'd separated. The seaplane was terrific news. Having to deal with Umbrella's bizarre key fetish yet again wasn't so terrific.
"And when I couldn't find them, I thought I'd wander over and see if you'd come across anything like that,"
he finished, shrugging again, working hard to look nonchalant.
"That's when I heard the shots. How about you? Anything interesting? Besides meeting up with a couple of Umbrella's monsters, I mean." "I'll say. Do you know anything about Alfred Ashford?"
"Only that him and his sister are total fruitcakes," Steve said promptly.
"And that the guards were scared of him. I could tell the way they avoided talking about him. He sent his own assistant to the infirmary, I heard. There was some kind of whacked-out doctor working there, I guess. A lot of prisoners got taken to the infirmary and never came back. Doesn't take a genius, you know."
Claire nodded, fascinated in spite of herself.
"What about the sister?" "I never heard much about her, except she's some kind of shut-in," Steve said. "No one even knows what she looks like. I think her name is Alexandria, maybe? I don't remember. Why?"
She filled him in on her encounters with Alfred, followed by a brief synopsis of where she'd been and what she'd found. When she mentioned that she had the medication she'd been looking for, Steve scowled and then blinked, his face clearly expressing a sudden change of heart.
"Maybe this Umbrella guy, Rodrigo," Claire interjected. "Okay, whatever," Steve said impatiently. "Maybe he knows something about these proof key things, like where they are." "Good idea." "It would beat searching the entire island, wouldn't it?" Claire said. "You up for a trip back to the prison? Assuming we can get out of here, that is."
"Oh, I'll clear us a path," Steve said, not a trace of doubt in his voice.
"You just leave that part to me."
Claire opened her mouth to comment on the pitfalls of overconfidence, particularly where Umbrella was concerned, then closed it again. Maybe it was his belief in himself that had carried him this far, that by not accepting the possibility of defeat, he was assuring himself a win.
"Fine in theory, dangerous in practice."
She'd be there to cover him at least.
"We were on the first floor of the training facility," he continued, "which means we're in the basement now. I know from my—"
Steve shook his head, flustered for some reason, but before she could ask about it, he continued on as if nothing had happened.
"There's a boiler room and a sewer area. Basically, we go that way," he said, gesturing at the door.
Claire decided not to point out that since it was the only door, she'd already come to that conclusion.
"I'm right behind you." "Stay close,"
Steve said roughly, walking to the door and looking back over the shoulder, trying to look fierce, his jaws set and his eyes narrowed. Claire was torn between irritation and laughter, finally choosing to think of it as endearing. Then he was opening the door, and the reality of their situation came back to her, floating in on the smell of gangrenous tissue. She stopped worrying about the little things, concentrating on the need to survive. What Steve knew about guns he could sum up in about 5 seconds, but he knew what he liked, and he decided immediately upon pulling the trigger of his newest find that it was the shit, hands down. He stepped out of the freight elevator, ready to kick some rotten ass, and he saw his opportunity less than 10 feet away. There were 5 of them in all. Well, 5.5, including the crawling mess on the floor over by the shelves. And all he had to do was tap the trigger, and then he was trying like hell to keep the weapon from flying out of his hand. He swept the kicking gun left to right, releasing the trigger as the last zombie's Swiss cheese brain parted company with its Swiss cheese head. It was all over in just a few seconds, so fast that it seemed unreal, like he'd coughed and a building had blown up or something. Claire had taken care of the floor pizza during his sweep, and when he turned around, triumphant, he was a little surprised to see that she wasn't smiling, until he thought about it for a second, and then he felt a little ashamed of himself. As far as he was concerned, they weren't really people anymore. He knew that if he were ever infected, he'd want someone to plug him, to keep him from hurting anyone else, not to mention granting him a fast death rather than letting him rot on the hoof. But they were human once. What happened to them was entirely shitty and unfair, no question. True, and maybe he should be more respectful. But on the other hand, the gun was extremely cool, and they were zombies. It was a touchy subject, not one he was prepared to mess around with, but he decided he could at least not laugh about it in front of Claire. He didn't want her to think he was some bloodthirsty asshole. He pointed at the door ahead and to the right, fairly sure that they were heading in the right direction, at least roughly. The way he figured it, they'd come out at least close to the front yard of the training facility. Claire nodded, and Steve led the way once again, pushing the door open and stepping through. They were standing at the top of a half-flight of open stairs leading down into the boiler room. A room full of big, battered-looking, hissing machinery anyway. Steve didn't actually know what a boiler looked like. There were 4 zombies milling around between them and the steps leading up and out on the other side of the cold, hissing room. Steve raised the machine gun and was about to fire when Claire tapped his arm, moving to stand beside him. "Watch," she said, and pointed her 9mm at the zombie group. Not quite, he saw. She was aiming low at something just past him. And, pow! 3 of the creatures went down, blackened and smoking. Behind them, what was left of a small, obviously combustible container, only jagged curls of splayed metal surrounded by a smudge of toxic smoke. The 4th zombie had been hit, but not as hard. Claire took it out with a single headshot before speaking again. "Saves ammo," she said simply, and brushed past him to walk down the steps. Steve followed, slightly awed by her, but playing it detached, like he'd already thought of that. If there was one thing he knew about chicks, it was that they didn't like guys who mooned all over them, acting all goofy. "Not that I give a shit what she thinks about me," he told himself firmly. "She's just kind of cool is all." Claire reached the next door first and waited until he caught up, nodded that he was ready. As soon as she opened it, they both relaxed. He could see her shoulders loosen and felt his own heart beating again. A dark stone walkway, totally empty, open on one side. There was water running somewhere below and some kind of narrow gate straight ahead, like an old-fashioned elevator door. "This is starting to seem a little too easy," Claire said softly. "Yeah," Steve whispered back. So much for Alfie Boy's evil playground shtick. They were about halfway across when they heard it, echoing up from somewhere in the black running waters below. A strangely high, piercing trill. Inhuman, but not like an animal either. Whatever it was, it sounded extremely pissed, and from the splashing noises, it was coming closer. Steve was ready to start shooting, but Claire grabbed his arm and took off running, practically jerking him off his feet. They were at the lift in about 2 seconds, Claire ripping the gate aside and shoving him into a tiny elevator cab, jumping in after him and slamming the gate closed. "Okay, geez, you don't have to push," Steve said, rubbing his arm indignantly. "Sorry," she said, pushing an errant strand of hair behind one ear, looking as rattled as he'd seen her get. "It's just, I've heard that sound before. Hunters, I think they're called. Extremely bad news. There were a bunch of them loose in Raccoon." She smiled shakily, which suddenly made him want to put his arm around her, or hold her hand or something. He didn't. "Brings up some bad memories, you know," she said. Raccoon. That was the place that had been blown up a few months ago, if he remembered right before he'd come to Rockford. The town's own police chief had done it. Did Umbrella have something to do with Raccoon? Claire seemed surprised, but then smiled a little easier, turning her attention to the elevator controls. "Long story. I'll tell you about it when we get out of here. So, first floor?" "Yeah," Steve said, then changed his mind. "Actually, Maybe we should go up to the second. That way we can look out over the yard, see what we'll be up against. You know, you're smarter than you look, Claire said teasingly, punching the button. Steve was still trying to think of a witty comeback when the elevator came to a stop and Claire opened the door. There was a shuttered, locked-down door to their right, so they went left, the short hallway empty. There was only one door in that direction, too, but they were in luck. The knob turned when Claire tried it. Again, there were no surprises. The door opened up to a cramped, wooden balcony thick with dust, overlooking a big room full of junk, a rusty military jeep, stacks of grungy old oil drums, broken boxes, and the like. It seemed more like a storage shed than anything else, and though it was well lit, there were enough piles of crap that it was impossible to see if anyone was down there. There was, though. Steve could hear shuffling noises. He took a few steps to the left, trying to see the corner beneath the balcony, and Claire followed. The boards creaked and shifted beneath their steps. "Doesn't seem too sturdy," Claire started, and was cut off by a giant splintering crack, pieces of the balcony floor flying up as both of them went down. "Shit!" Steve didn't even have time to tense for the impact. It was over so quick. He landed on his left side, jarring his shoulder, his left knee cracking against a random bit of wood. Almost immediately, a pyramid of empty barrels fell over behind him, clattering hollowly to the ground, and Steve heard a zombie's hungry wail. "Claire?" Steve called, crawling to his feet and turning, looking for her and the zombie. There she was, amid the barrels, still down, rubbing one ankle. Her handgun was about 10 feet away. Steve saw her eyes go wide and followed her gaze, a lone zombie teetering toward her. And all he could do was stare at it, his body suddenly a million miles away. Claire said something, but he couldn't hear her, too intent on the virus carrier. It had been a big man, leaning toward fat, but someone had blasted off part of his gut. The open, sticky, belly wounds were seeping, the dark shirt made even darker by the almost uniform layer of blood that had soaked the cloth. It was gray-faced and hollow-eyed, like all of them, and had either bitten through its tongue or had been eating his. Its mouth was smeared with blood. Claire said something else, but Steve was remembering something. A sudden, vivid flash of memory so real that it was almost like reliving the experience. He'd been 4 or 5 years old when his parents had taken him to his first parade, a Thanksgiving parade. He was sitting on his father's shoulder, watching the clowns go by, surrounded by loud, shouting people, and he'd started to cry. He couldn't remember why. What he remembered was his father looking up at him, his eyes concerned and full of love. When he'd asked what was wrong, his voice was so familiar and well-loved that Steve had wrapped his tiny arms around his father's neck and hidden his face, still crying, but knowing he was safe, that no harm could come to him so long as his father held him. "Steve!" Claire practically screaming his name, and he saw that the zombie was almost on top of her, its gray fingers closing around her vest, pulling her up to its drooling, bloody mouth. Steve screamed too, opening fire, the thunder of bullets ripping into his father's face and body, tearing him away from Claire. He kept firing, kept screaming until his father lay still and the thunder had stopped, only dry clicks coming from the gun. And then Claire was touching his shoulder, turning him away as he called out for his father, weeping. They sat for a while. When he could speak, he told her about it, parts of it, his arms around his knees and head down. Told her about his father, who had worked for Umbrella as a truck driver, who had been caught trying to steal a formula from one of their labs. He told her about his mother, who had been gunned down by a trio of Umbrella soldiers in their own home, lay choking and bloody and dying on the living room floor when Steve came home from school. The men had taken them away, taken Steve and his father to Rockford. "I thought he was killed in the airstrike," Steve said, wiping at his eyes. "I wanted to feel bad about it. I did, but I just kept thinking about Mom, about how she looked. But I didn't want him to die. I didn't. I loved him too." Saying it out loud made him start crying again. Claire's arm was around him, but he barely felt it, so sad that he thought he might die. He knew he had to get up. He had to find the keys and go with Claire and fly the plane. But none of that seemed important anymore. Claire had been mostly quiet, only listening and holding him. But she stood up now and told him to stay where he was, that she'd be back soon, and then they could leave. That was okay. It was good. He wanted to be alone. And he was more exhausted than he'd ever been in his life, so tired and heavy that he didn't want to move. Claire went away, and Steve decided that he should go looking for the proof keys soon. Very soon. As soon as he stopped shaking.